The Pacific theater of World War II was a landscape of unforgiving jungle and coral atolls. The Japanese military doctrine was built upon the ancient code of bushidō, emphasizing honor and a resolute disdain for surrender. This deep-seated cultural belief found its most terrifying military expression in the Banzai Charge. It was not merely a last-ditch attack, but a profound, mass suicide assault intended to shatter the enemy's psychological will. The rallying cry, Banzai, meaning 10,000 years, was an invocation of imperial and national longevity. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated to view death in battle as the ultimate fulfillment of their duty. They believed the spiritual power of their sacrifice was a force no purely material defense could withstand. Early in the war, this ferocity often achieved its desired effect, overwhelming Allied lines with sheer, shocking desperation. Units would fix bayonets and rush forward in a screaming, chaotic wave, completely ignoring their massive casualties. The psychological damage inflicted by a nighttime Banzai charge was often as effective as the physical damage. Allied troops, accustomed to conventional warfare, were initially paralyzed by an enemy who seemed to disregard all notions of self-preservation. This initial success cemented the Banzai charge as a core, high-risk, and high-cost tactic in the Japanese military playbook. It became the ultimate symbol of the difference between the two armies' philosophical approaches to war. The Japanese command tragically overestimated the lasting power of this spiritual resolve against modern firepower. They failed to account for the American capacity to adapt and innovate new counters to this form of human wave warfare. The conviction that their charges were unstoppable became a costly strategic blunder that would doom thousands of their men. The Banzai charge was a clash of ideologies, the spirit of the samurai against the steel and logistics of the American war machine. This unwavering faith in a sacrificial assault created a predictable pattern that the Americans would eventually exploit with devastating effect. The very nature of the charge meant the Japanese were fighting to die, while the Americans were learning to fight to kill efficiently. This foundational difference set the stage for the technological and tactical revolution that was about to unfold on the islands. The need for an anti-Banzai solution became the driving force behind the U.S. development of new anti-fortification weaponry. The initial months of the war saw the Imperial Japanese Army sweep across the Pacific with terrifying, relentless speed. Key Allied strongholds, from the Philippines to Singapore, fell with astonishing rapidity, confirming the Japanese belief in their own military prowess. The Banzai charge played a crucial, visible role in these early conquests, demoralizing unprepared Allied garrisons. Japanese forces used the element of surprise and fanaticism to turn conventional defensive lines into scenes of utter carnage. In many instances, the Allied forces simply lacked the doctrine or the experience to counter such a committed, life-ending attack. The defenders were not prepared for an enemy that would rush through a hailstorm of bullets just to reach their lines for hand-to-hand combat. This early phase of the war created an undeniable aura of invincibility around the Japanese soldier and their charging tactic. News reports filtering back to the United States spoke of an enemy that was uniquely ferocious and terrifyingly dedicated. The psychological toll on the Allied survivors was immense, influencing future battle planning and fear of the Japanese. However, these early victories were often achieved against poorly supplied and strategically isolated Allied forces. The Japanese High Command misinterpreted this initial success as a validation of the Banzai charge's inherent tactical superiority. They failed to consider the overwhelming material superiority of the United States that would soon enter the fray. As the battles moved to the smaller, heavily contested islands, the dynamics of the fighting began to change fundamentally. The Americans, particularly the Marines, quickly adapted their defensive formations and training to anticipate the nighttime charges. They learned to establish interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that no sector of the perimeter was left unprotected. Machine gun placement became an art form, designed to create a literal curtain of lead to shred the advancing human waves. The Americans had to overcome their initial psychological shock and learn to view the charging soldiers as simply targets to be eliminated. This evolution in defense showed that the Banzai charge could be countered by disciplined, concentrated, and overwhelming firepower. Yet, the inherent ferocity of the Japanese attack still forced American planners to seek an even more decisive solution. They needed a weapon that could not only stop the charge, but also deny the enemy the protective cover from which it could launch. The need for a weapon that could destroy the man and the fortification simultaneously became a paramount objective. Guadalcanal was the first true inflection point in the Pacific War, where the American forces finally seized the initiative. The struggle for Henderson Field became a protracted, grueling lesson in defensive jungle warfare for the U.S. Marines and Army. It was here that the Japanese launched some of their most determined and costly Banzai charges. These attacks were almost exclusively launched under the cover of darkness, leveraging the jungle's inherent confusion and terror. The Americans learned to listen for the chilling, coordinated screams that signaled the beginning of the desperate assault. Defensive positions were fortified with layers of barbed wire, trip flares, and pre-registered artillery fire zones. The crucial lesson learned was that the perimeter had to hold, regardless of the chaos and the proximity of the enemy. Marines were instructed to wait until the Japanese were in the effective range of automatic weapons before opening fire. The resulting battles, such as the fight along the Lunga perimeter, were scenes of apocalyptic firepower and human desperation. American machine guns would often overheat, firing continuously into the oncoming waves of charging Japanese soldiers. The sheer volume of fire delivered by the American defenses proved mathematically superior to the Japanese spiritual resolve. The charges inflicted casualties but failed to achieve any significant, lasting strategic objective on Guadalcanal. They often succeeded only in bleeding the Japanese forces of irreplaceable veteran troops and essential manpower. The Japanese command, however, remained committed to the tactic, viewing the high casualties as proof of their men's valor. This continuous sacrifice began to highlight the fundamental flaw in the Japanese defensive philosophy. They were relying on a medieval, shock-based tactic against a modern, industrialized army with limitless material reserves. The Americans recognized that while the Banzai charge was terrifying, it was also highly inefficient and predictable. They began to look beyond holding the line and towards a solution for eliminating the Japanese before they could even organize a charge. This shift in thinking led to the realization that the fortifications themselves were the root of the problem. The need to destroy the network of trenches and bunkers became the next great tactical challenge for the American forces. It was a realization that the war would be won not by waiting for the charge, but by annihilating the charging positions. The invasion of Saipan in July 1944 resulted in the largest and most devastating Banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. This single, colossal attack tragically underscored the utter futility of the tactic against a prepared American defense. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers, supported by a few tanks, massed for a final, suicidal counterattack. The charge was launched in the early morning hours, intended to overrun the forward elements of the American lines. It began with the usual coordinated screaming and a desperate rush from the remnants of the Japanese garrison. The American troops, seasoned by years of island combat, did not break. Instead, they unleashed a storm of concentrated fire. Machine guns, artillery, and even naval gunfire were brought to bear on the tightly packed mass of charging soldiers. The resulting carnage was unprecedented, with thousands of Japanese soldiers mowed down in a few short hours. The American line bent but did not break, absorbing the shock and then violently repelling the suicidal wave. The remnants of the Japanese force that broke through were quickly eliminated in brutal hand-to-hand combat. This battle demonstrated beyond any doubt that the Banzai charge had been rendered strategically obsolete. It became a textbook example of a military doctrine choosing fanatical sacrifice over rational, tactical effectiveness. The Japanese losses were so catastrophic that the battle effectively ended all organized resistance on Saipan. For the American soldiers, the spectacle was both terrifying and sickening, a grim realization of their enemy's dedication. Yet, it reinforced the absolute necessity of maintaining disciplined, overwhelming firepower at all times. The charge was a final, desperate ideological statement that cost the lives of an entire division of men. This massacre forced a quiet, but profound, reassessment among the remaining Japanese commanders in other theaters. Many began to realize that the tactic was simply a waste of their limited, precious manpower reserves. It was on Saipan that the Banzai charge's mythical invincibility died a bloody, final death. The Americans had mastered the art of defending against the human wave, but the deeper fortifications remained a costly issue. They still needed a better tool to root out the enemy hiding within the unyielding rock and concrete bunkers. As the American campaign moved further west, the Japanese strategy shifted from open defense to entrenched resistance. The island-hopping campaign led American forces to places like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. These islands had been meticulously transformed into subterranean fortresses over many months or even years. Japanese engineers had utilized the natural coral, volcanic rock, and terrain to construct elaborate, deep defensive networks. These defenses consisted of massive, reinforced concrete pillboxes, interlocking bunkers, and miles of hidden tunnels and caves. The design was based on mutual support, ensuring that every American advance would face fire from multiple concealed positions. The garrisons were protected from the preliminary naval and air bombardment, which often proved surprisingly ineffective. The American attackers were forced to leave the relative safety of their landing craft and fight a close-quarters battle against an unseen enemy. The fighting became a slow, agonizing process of eliminating each strong point one by one, often at a terrible cost in lives. Standard infantry weapons, including rifles and fragmentation grenades, were frustratingly useless against the thick concrete walls. Engineers armed with satchel charges had to brave suicidal fire to physically place the explosives on the targets. The battle was no longer a simple perimeter defense, but a grueling siege against a nearly invisible, deeply entrenched enemy. The Japanese were now playing a war of attrition, aiming to make every square meter of ground cost an American life. This defensive change was an acknowledgement of American firepower, but created a new, equally daunting tactical problem. The static defense nullified the Banzai charge as a main tactic, but it replaced it with a prolonged, grinding hell. The American command desperately sought a weapon that could reach inside these fortresses without endangering its assault teams. They needed a way to flush out the tenacious, hidden defenders without resorting to complex, high-risk demolition efforts. The key requirement was a weapon that could bypass the physical shell of the bunker and attack the men sheltering inside. This search for a close-quarters, anti-fortification solution led them directly to the revival of a World War I-era weapon. The nature of the battlefield demanded a solution that delivered not high explosive force, but pure, overwhelming, internal destruction. Faced with the impenetrable nature of the Japanese island fortresses, American ingenuity focused on a devastating countermeasure. The weapon they turned to was the flamethrower, a device that had seen limited, specialized use in earlier conflicts. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps began a rapid development program to adapt and improve the existing technology for jungle combat. The result was the M1 and the improved M2 flamethrower, which became the essential tool for bunker clearance. The M2 was a heavy but relatively simple device, consisting of two fuel tanks, a pressure tank, and a discharge gun. It projected a thick stream of napalm, a jellied gasoline compound, that adhered to surfaces and burned with intense, searing heat. The weapon's great advantage was its ability to flow through a bunker's narrow firing aperture or ventilation shaft. Once inside, the burning fuel instantly filled the entire space with smoke, fire, and suffocating, high-temperature gases. The flamethrower didn't have to destroy the concrete structure. It only had to destroy the environment within it. It offered a solution that required less exposure time for the operator than manually placing a satchel charge. The psychological effect of the weapon was immediately recognized as its second, equally potent advantage. Facing a bullet was one thing, but being subjected to a relentless stream of fire was an entirely different kind of terror. The knowledge that their supposedly safe concrete shelters were now fire traps began to erode the Japanese will to resist. The flamethrower became the exclusive domain of specialist teams, often combat engineers, who carried the immense responsibility of carrying it. These men were well aware that the tanks on their backs made them primary targets for every Japanese defender. Their training emphasized speed, teamwork, and the coordinated use of supporting fire to survive the close-quarters attack. The weapon was the perfect foil for the Japanese doctrine of static, man-in-hole defense. It proved that a purely physical defense could not withstand a weapon that targeted the very air the defenders breathed. The flamethrower was the technological answer to the Japanese tactical puzzle, a brutal solution to a brutal problem. It represented the turning point where the American method of systematic, technological annihilation superseded the Japanese method of desperate sacrifice. The moment the flamethrower was deployed in force, the dynamics of the island warfare shifted dramatically. The weapon earned immediate, visceral nicknames from the Japanese, most notably the Devil's Breath. Its presence alone was often enough to neutralize a fortified position without ever firing a shot. The Japanese garrisons knew instantly that the arrival of a flamethrower team signaled a point of no return. The sound of the roaring flame and the visible torrent of napalm had an utterly demoralizing effect on the defenders. Once the stream of fire entered a bunker, survival became a matter of mere seconds for those inside. The intense heat quickly cooked the air, and the dense smoke made breathing impossible, forcing a desperate flight. The defenders were left with an impossible choice: be burned alive or charge out into a storm of American machine gun fire. This forced evacuation into a prepared kill zone was exactly what the American assault teams were hoping to achieve. The flamethrower thus served as a brutal psychological weapon that channeled the Japanese into their pre-planned doom. The efficiency of the weapon was terrifyingly high, replacing hours of grueling combat with minutes of concentrated destruction. A single, well-aimed burst could render an entire pillbox or cave network indefensible. The flamethrower operator became the most dangerous man on the battlefield to the entrenched Japanese. His weapon bypassed the thick concrete and steel, reaching the enemy where they felt safest and most protected. This sudden loss of sanctuary shattered the defensive paradigm that the Japanese had meticulously constructed. The fortified islands were no longer traps for the Americans, but traps for the Japanese garrisons themselves. The sheer horror of the burning napalm also eroded the spiritual resolve that fueled the Banzai charge. It is one thing to be killed by a bullet, but another to be consumed by a torrent of unquenchable fire. The weapon effectively turned the Japanese doctrine of fighting to the last man into a grim, fiery guarantee of death. The flamethrower was the definitive countermeasure that completely nullified the long-term effectiveness of their elaborate fortifications. Its arrival marked the true beginning of the methodical, systematic clearance that characterized the later stages of the Pacific War. The flamethrower's impact extended far beyond the immediate physical destruction it caused. It created a profound crisis of morale and a deep psychological breakdown within the confined Japanese garrisons. Japanese soldiers who had bravely endured endless artillery bombardments were reduced to panic by the presence of fire. The darkness and close quarters of the tunnel networks amplified the terror, turning the caves into claustrophobic hells. The echoing roar of the flamethrower from a distance became a sound of inescapable, approaching doom. It made the concept of a safe position completely non-existent, destroying the Japanese soldiers' last anchor of security. Diaries and captured documents revealed the intense fear and resignation that the fire weapon instilled in the men. The weapon undermined the core military value of holding one's post at all costs, as holding the post meant a fiery end. The knowledge that their concrete fortresses were vulnerable to internal destruction caused tactical discipline to fray. Soldiers were often tempted to abandon their posts prematurely, running the risk of being shot by their own officers for cowardice. The presence of flamethrowers greatly reduced the Japanese capacity for effective counterattacks or organized Banzai efforts. It forced the few remaining defenders into desperate, small-scale acts of infiltration rather than massed assaults. This shift was a victory for the American forces, who preferred to deal with isolated, small groups rather than a coordinated rush. The flamethrower was a psychological masterstroke that systematically broke the Japanese fighting spirit from the inside out. It achieved a level of demoralization that mere high explosives could never have accomplished. The enemy who was once willing to die was now desperately trying to find a way to escape a horrifying death. This fundamental change in the psychological state of the Japanese forces accelerated the rate of American advance. It demonstrated that technology could be wielded not just as a killer, but as a terrorizer of the enemy's will. The shadow of the flamethrower fell across every remaining Japanese defensive position in the Pacific. It served as a constant, dreadful reminder that the Americans had solved the final great riddle of the Island War. The effectiveness of the flamethrower was maximized by integrating it into a standardized assault doctrine known as blowtorch and corkscrew. This was a highly coordinated three-man or four-man team operation that turned bunker clearance into a disciplined, efficient procedure. The team's success relied on the perfect synchronization of supporting fire, fire projection, and explosive demolition. The blowtorch phase began with the flamethrower operator, protected by an assistant, approaching the fortified position. The supporting riflemen or machine gunners would saturate the bunker's firing slit to keep the defenders' heads down. The operator would then fire a concentrated, sustained burst of napalm directly into the narrow opening. This fire was designed to kill or incapacitate the defenders and also to force anyone surviving deeper into the structure. Immediately following the ceasefire, the corkscrew phase began with the demolition specialist. This soldier would swiftly move to the bunker's entrance or roof and place a satchel charge or high explosive block. The resulting detonation was designed to cave in the fortification, eliminating any remaining Japanese threat trapped inside. The combination of fire and explosion was a final, undeniable act of tactical finality for the Japanese position. The whole process was executed with ruthless speed and precision, reducing the time the assault team was exposed to enemy fire. This method was a direct, tactical counter to the entire Japanese defensive engineering philosophy. It transformed the attack on a strong point from a desperate, high-casualty siege into a procedural demolition job. The flamethrower, therefore, was not the end of the operation but the crucial enabler of the subsequent demolition. Without the fire to clear the opening and suppress the defenders, the demolition expert could never have placed the charge safely. The blowtorch and corkscrew tactic became the gold standard for bunker clearance in the later Pacific campaigns. It showed that the Americans had learned to fight smarter, not just harder, against their entrenched foe. This highly specialized approach systematically dismantled the vast, interconnected defensive networks of the island garrisons. The simple yet devastating logic of this tactic broke the Japanese ability to conduct any form of sustained, static resistance. Further refinement of the flamethrower concept led to the ultimate anti-fortification weapon, the flamethrower tank. The American military mounted powerful flamethrowers onto the robust, reliable chassis of the M4 Sherman tank. These tanks, nicknamed Zippo or Ronson tanks, vastly increased the range and fuel capacity of the weapon. The M4A3R3 version could project its devastating stream of fire hundreds of feet, keeping the crew safe behind thick armor. This innovation eliminated the vulnerability of the infantry flamethrower operator, who was easily targeted on foot. The flamethrower tank could approach heavily fortified positions with impunity, saturating them with fire from a safe distance. The vehicle was capable of hosing down entire cave mouths and clearing large sections of jungle with unstoppable fire. It provided the Americans with a mobile, protected, and overwhelming source of close-quarters destruction. The tank's arrival on the battlefield made the very idea of a successful Banzai charge against that sector entirely unthinkable. No desperate, human wave attack could possibly withstand the combined threat of the tank's armor and its fiery main weapon. The flamethrower tank also worked in tandem with the infantry assault teams, providing continuous, rolling cover fire. It could burn out pillboxes that were too large or too deeply entrenched for the portable flamethrowers to handle effectively. This was a major escalation in the technological war against the Japanese defensive mindset. The weapon further solidified the American tactical advantage in the brutal, grinding phase of the island campaigns. The Japanese had no effective, equivalent counterweapon to the flamethrower tank in their inventory. They were forced to rely on mines or desperate suicide attacks to disable the vehicles, which proved largely ineffective. The Zippo tank became the final, decisive nail in the coffin of the Japanese belief in spiritual superiority over material force. Its presence signaled that the American military was capable of solving any tactical problem thrown in its path. The use of the flamethrower tank proved that even the most determined, fortified defense could be methodically and safely eliminated. This armor-protected fire weapon allowed the Americans to maintain the momentum of their offensive with reduced casualties. The battle for Iwo Jima represents the grim, final chapter in the story of the Banzai Charge's demise. The Japanese commander, General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, was a pragmatic strategist who understood the futility of the mass charge. He specifically forbade the traditional Banzai attacks on Iwo Jima, knowing they would only result in a pointless massacre. Kurabayashi's plan was instead a relentless, prolonged defense from deep, interconnected, and non-bunkered cave systems. His goal was not to win the island back, but to inflict the highest possible number of American casualties through attrition. Yet, even this rationalized, defensive strategy ultimately failed against the omnipresent threat of the flamethrower. The American assault teams, armed with both portable and tank-mounted flamethrowers, systematically cleared every cave and crevice. The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima absorbed high explosives, but the heat and fire from the napalm were unstoppable. The Marines faced a new kind of hell, but they had the tools to conquer the subterranean labyrinth. They followed the fire into the depths, relentlessly sealing off and incinerating every pocket of resistance. The flamethrower was absolutely essential to the American success in rooting out the tenacious defenders of Iwo Jima. While a final, desperate charge did occur on the island, it was a small-scale, unauthorized act by survivors. This final attack was swiftly and brutally put down, underscoring its irrelevance to the battle's outcome. The sheer destructive efficiency of the flamethrower on Iwo Jima demonstrated its complete mastery over the Japanese defense. The cost to the Americans was still staggering, but the weapon ensured they could win the battle quickly. It was a victory forged in fire, a testament to the tactical necessity of a weapon of absolute destruction. The battle confirmed that the era of the human wave was definitively over, replaced by the era of the controlled burn. Kurabayashi's rational defense met its match in the technological superiority of the American assault. The final, chilling lesson of Iwo Jima was that no amount of sacrifice could overcome the power of directed, concentrated fire. The island served as a smoking monument to the weapon that had rendered the legendary Banzai charge a mere footnote in history. The flamethrower remains one of the most controversial and viscerally brutal weapons ever deployed in modern combat. It was a necessary evil, a specialized tool created to solve a unique and terrifying tactical problem in the Pacific War. The weapon fundamentally changed the infantry combat doctrine of the 20th century, cementing the need for combined arms. Its use saved countless American lives by offering a quick, decisive method for neutralizing heavily fortified positions. The flamethrower was a symbol of American tactical adaptation against an enemy dedicated to fighting to the death. Its enduring legacy, however, is one of terror and unmitigated destructive power against human life. The images of fire sweeping over the bunkers of the Pacific Islands are among the most grim and indelible of the war. Following World War II, the portable flamethrower gradually faded from the inventory of most major armies. This decline was due to the weapon's limited range, heavy weight, and the availability of more modern, less controversial thermobaric weapons. The ethical considerations surrounding its use also contributed to its gradual phase-out from frontline combat roles. Yet, its story is a perfect case study in the military evolution of the Pacific theater. It stands as the final, absolute counter to the Japanese doctrine that the human spirit was superior to material force. The flamethrower exposed the vulnerability of even the strongest defenses and the fragility of human resolve against a force of nature. It forced the Japanese to abandon their high-risk, high-cost Banzai tactics for more conventional, albeit equally doomed, defensive measures. The final lesson is that in modern warfare, no doctrine is truly unstoppable if the enemy possesses the ingenuity to adapt. The flamethrower was the decisive answer to the Banzai charge and the fortified islands it defended. It remains a stark reminder of the lengths to which soldiers must go to survive and conquer in the crucible of war. The weapon's success lies in its simple, terrifying efficiency in a time when there were no other effective options. It represents the ultimate triumph of technology and cold tactical logic over fanatical, suicidal conviction. The Devil's Breath ended the war's most brutal human wave attack, but its own story will forever burn in history's memory.